will do anything. Mossad has no qualms doing what it takes to ensure the survival of every Israeli citizen around the world. Most other countries will stop at some point, but Mossad doesn't do that.
The following is a conversation with Andrew Bustamante, former CIA covert intelligence officer and U.S. Air Force combat veteran, including the job of operational targeting, encrypted communications, and launch operations for 200 nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles. Andrew's over 7 years as a CIA spy have given him a skill set and a perspective on the world that is fascinating to explore. This is the Lex Fridman Podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Andrew Bustamante. The Central Intelligence Agency was formed almost 75 years ago. What is the mission of the CIA? How does it work?
The mission of the CIA is to collect intelligence from around the world that supports a national security mission and be the central repository for all other intelligence agencies so that it's one collective source where all intelligence can be synthesized and then passed forward to the decision makers.
That doesn't include domestic intelligence. It's primarily looking outward, outside the United States.
Correct. CIA is the foreign intelligence collection king spoke, if you will. FBI does domestic, and then Department of Homeland Security does domestic. Law enforcement essentially handles all things domestic. Intelligence is not law enforcement, so we technically cannot work inside the United States.
Is there clear lines to be drawn between, like you just said, the FBI, CIA, FBI, and the other U.S. intelligence agencies like the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of Homeland Security, NSA, National Security Agency, and there's a list.
There's a list of about 33 different intelligence organizations. Yeah,
so like the Army, the Navy has all the different organizations have their own intelligence groups. So is there clear lines here to be drawn, or is the CIA the giant integrator of all of these?
It's a little bit of both, to be honest. So yes, there are absolutely lines, and more so than the lines, there are lines that divide what our primary mission is. Everything's got to be prioritized. That's one of the benefits and the superpowers of the United States is we prioritize everything. So different intelligence organizations are prioritized to collect certain types of intelligence. And then within the confines of how they collect, they're also given unique authorities. Authorities are a term that's directed by the executive branch. Different agencies have different authorities to execute missions in different ways. FBI can't execute the same way CIA executes, and CIA can't execute the same way NGA executes. But then at the end, when it's all collected, then yes, CIA still acts as a final synthesizing repository to create what's known as the President's Daily Brief, the PDB. The only way CIA can create the PDB is by being the single source of all source intelligence from around the IC, the intelligence community, which are those 30 some odd and always changing organizations that are sponsored for intelligence operations.
What does the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, look like? How long is it? What does it contain?
So first of all, it looks like the most expensive book report you can ever imagine. It's got its own binder. It's all very high end. It feels important. It looks important. It's not like a cheap Trapper Keeper. It's somewhere between, I would give it probably between 50 and 125 pages a day. It's produced every day around 2:00 in the morning by a dedicated group of analysts. And each page is essentially a short paragraph to a few paragraphs about a priority happening that affects national security from around the world. The president rarely gets to the entire briefing in a day. He relies on a briefer instead to prioritize what inside the briefing needs to be shared with the president. Because some days the PDB will get briefed in 10 minutes, and some days it'll be briefed over the course of 2 hours. It depends on the president's schedule.
How much competition is there for the first page? And how much jockeying there is for attention? I imagine for all the different intelligence agencies, and within the CIA, there's probably different groups that are modular, and they all care about different nations or different cases. And do you understand how much competition there is for the limited attention of the president?
You're 100% correct in how the agency and how officers and managers at the agency handle the PDB. There's a ton of competition. Everybody wants to be the first on the radar. Everybody wants to be on the first page. The thing that we're not baking into the equation is the president's interests. The president dictates what's on the first page of his PDB, and he will tell them usually the day before, I want to see this on the first page tomorrow. Bring this to me in the beginning. I don't want to hear about what's happening in Mozambique. I don't really care about what's happening in Saudi Arabia. I want to see 1, 2, 3. And regardless of whether or not those are the three biggest things in the world, the president's the executive. He's the ultimate customer. So we do what the customer says. That has backfired in the past. If you haven't already started seeing how that could go wrong, that has backfired in the past. But that is essentially what happens when you serve in the executive branch. You serve the executive.
So what's the role of the director of the CIA versus the president? What's that dance like? So the president really leads the focus of the CIA?
The president is the commander-in-chief for the military, but the executive, the president is also the executive for the entirety of the intelligence community. So he's the ultimate customer. If you look at it like a business, the customer, the person spending the money, is the president, and the director is the CEO. So if the director doesn't create what the president wants, there's going to be a new director. That's why the director of CIA is a presidential appointed position. Sometimes they're extremely qualified intelligence professionals. Sometimes they're just professional politicians or soldiers that get put into that seat because the president trusts them to do what he wants them to do. Another gaping area that causes problems, but that's still the way it is.
So you think this is a problematic configuration of the whole system?
Massive flaw in the system. It is a massive flaw in the system because if you're essentially appointing a director to do what you want them to do, then you're assigning a crony. And that's what we define corruption as within the United States. And inside the United States, we say, if you pick somebody outside of merit for any other reason other than merit, then it's cronyism or it's nepotism. Here, that's exactly what our structure is built on. All presidential appointees are appointed on something other than merit.
So for an intelligence agency to be effective, it has to discover the truth and communicate that truth. And maybe if you're appointing the director of that agency, they're less likely to communicate the truth to you unless the truth aligns perfectly with your desired worldview.
Well, not necessarily perfectly, because there are other steps, right? They have to go in front of Congress, and they have to have the support of multiple legislators. But the challenge is that the short list of people who even get the opportunity aren't a meritorious list. It's a short list based off of who the president is picking or who the would-be president is picking. Now, I think we've proven that an intelligence organization can be extremely effective even within the flawed system.
Yeah.
The challenge is, how much more effective could we be if we improved? And I think that's the challenge that faces a lot of the U.S. government. I think that's a challenge that has resulted in what we see today when it comes to the decline of American power and American influence, the rise of foreign influence, authoritarian powers, and a shrinking U.S. economy, a growing Chinese economy. And it's just, we have hard questions we need to ask ourselves about how we're going to handle the future.
What aspect of that communication between the president and the CIA could be fixed to help fix the problems that you're referring to in terms of the decline of American power? So
when you talk about the president wanting to prioritize what the president cares about, that immediately shows a break between what actually matters to the long-term success of the United States versus what benefits the short-term success of the current president.
Because any president is just a human being and has a very narrow focus. And narrow focus is not a long-term calculation.
Exactly. What's the maximum amount of years a president can be president? 8.
Yeah.
He or she.
In the United States.
In the United States, according to our current constitution.
Yeah.
But they're very limited in terms of what they have to prioritize. And then if you look at a 4-year cycle, 2 years of that is essentially preparing for the next election cycle. So that's only 2 years of really quality attention you get from the president, who's the chief executive of all the intelligence community. So the most important thing to them is not always the most important thing to the long-term survival of the United States.
What do you make of the hostile relationship that, to me at least, stands out of the presidents between Donald Trump and the CIA? Was that a very kind of personal bickering? I mean, is there something interesting to you about the dynamics between that particular president and that particular instantiation of the intelligence agency?
Man, there were lots of things fascinating to me about that relationship. So first,
What's the good and the bad? Sorry to interrupt.
So let me start with the good first, because there's a lot of people who don't think there was any good. So the good thing is we saw that the president, who's the chief customer, the executive to the CIA, when the president doesn't want to hear what CIA has to say, he's not going to listen. I think that's an important lesson for everyone to take home. If the president doesn't care what you have to say, he's going to take funding away, or she will take funding away. They're going to take attention away. They're going to shut down your operations, your missions. They're going to kill the careers of the people working there. Think about that. For the 4 years that President Trump was the president, basically everybody at CIA, their career was put on pause. Some people's careers were ended. Some people voluntarily left their career there because they found themselves working for a single customer that didn't want what they had to produce.
So for people who don't know, Donald Trump did not display significant, deep interest in the output.
He did not trust it. Yeah,
he was a disinterested customer.
Exactly right.
Of the information.
And then what do disinterested customers do? They go find someone else to create their product. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did. And he did it through the private intelligence world, funding private intelligence companies to run their own operations that brought him the information he cared about when CIA wouldn't. It also didn't help that CIA stepped outside of their confines, right? CIA is supposed to collect foreign intelligence and not comment on domestic matters. They went way outside of that when they started challenging the president, when they started questioning the results, when they started publicly claiming Russian influence. That's all something the FBI could have handled by itself. The Justice Department could have handled by itself. CIA had no place to contribute to that conversation. And when they did, all they did was undermine the relationship they had with their primary customer.
Let me sort of focus in on this relationship between the president or the leader and the intelligence agency and look outside the United States. It seems like authoritarian regimes or regimes throughout history, if you look at Stalin and Hitler, if you look at today with Vladimir Putin, the negative effects of power corrupting the mind of a leader manifests itself is that they start to get bad information from the intelligence agencies. So this kind of thing that you're talking about, over time, they start hearing information they want to hear. The agency starts producing only the kind of information they want to hear, and the leader's worldview starts becoming distorted to where the propaganda they generate is also the thing that the intelligence agencies provide to them. And so they start believing their own propaganda, and they start getting a distorted view of the world. Sorry for the sort of walking through in a weird way, but I guess I want to ask, do you think, let's look at Vladimir Putin specifically, do you think he's getting accurate information about the world? Do you think he knows the truth of the world, whether that's the war in Ukraine, whether that's the behavior of the other nations in NATO, the United States in general? What do you think?
It's rare that I'll talk about just thinking. I prefer to share my assessment, why I assess things a certain way, rather than just what's my random opinion. In my assessment, Vladimir Putin is winning. Russia is winning. They're winning in Ukraine, but they're also winning the battle of influence against the West. They're winning in the face of economic sanctions. They're winning. Empirically, when you look at the math, they're winning. So when you ask me whether or not Putin is getting good information from his intelligence services, when I look at my overall assessment of multiple data points, he must be getting good information. Do I know how or why? I do not. I don't know how or why it works there. I don't know how such deep cronyism, such deep corruption can possibly yield true, real results. And yet somehow there are real results happening. So it's either excessive waste and an accidental win, or there really is a system and a process there that's functioning.
So this winning idea is very interesting. In what way, short term and long term, is Russia winning? Some people say there was a miscalculation of the way the invasion happened. There was an assumption that you would be able to successfully take Kyiv. You'd be able to successfully capture the east, the south, and the north of Ukraine. And with what now appears to be significantly insufficient troops spread way too thin across way too large of a front. So that seems to be like an intelligence failure. And that doesn't seem to be like winning. In another way, it doesn't seem like winning if we put aside the human cost of war. It doesn't seem like winning because the hearts and minds of the West were completely on the side of Ukraine. This particular leader in Volodymyr Zelensky captured the attention of the world and the hearts and minds of Europe, the West, and many other nations throughout the world, both financially, in terms of military equipment, and in terms of sort of social and cultural and emotional support for the independence fight of this nation. That seems to be like a miscalculation. So against that pushback, why do you think there's still kernels of winning in this on the Russian side?
What you're laying out isn't incorrect. And the miscalculations are not unexpected. Anybody who's been to a military college, including the Army War College in Pennsylvania, where so many of our military leaders are brought up, when you look at the conflict in Ukraine, it fits the exact mold of what an effective, long-term military conflict, protracted military conflict, would and should look like for military dominance. Now, did Zelensky and did the Ukrainians shock the world? Absolutely. But in that, they also shocked American intelligence, which, like you said, miscalculated. The whole world miscalculated how the Ukrainians would respond. Putin did not move in there accidentally. He had an assessment. He had high likelihood of a certain outcome, and that outcome did not happen. Why did he have that calculation? Because in 2014, it worked. He invaded, he took Crimea in 14 days. He basically created an infiltration campaign that turned key leaders over in the first few days of the conflict. So essentially, there was no conflict. It worked in 2008 when he took Georgia. Nobody talks about that. He invaded Georgia the exact same way, and it worked. So in 2008, it worked. In 2014, it worked. There was no reason to believe it wasn't going to work again. So he just carried out the same campaign. But this time, something was different. That was a miscalculation, for sure, on the part of Putin. And the reason that there was no support from the West, because let's not forget, there is no support. There is nothing other than the Lend-Lease Act, which is putting Ukraine in massive debt right now to the West. That's the only form of support they're getting from NATO or the United States. So if somebody believed Ukraine would win, if somebody believed Ukraine had a chance, they would have gotten more material support than just debt. And we can jump into that anytime you want to. But the whole world miscalculated. Everybody thought Russia was going to win in 14 days. I said that they would win in 14 days because that was the predominant calculation. Once the first invasion didn't work, then the military does what professional militaries do, man. They reevaluate, they reorganize leaders, and then they take a new approach. You saw 3 approaches. The first 2 did not work. The first 2 campaigns against Ukraine did not work the way they were supposed to work. The third has worked exactly like it's supposed to work. You don't need Kiev to win Ukraine. You don't need hearts and minds to win Ukraine.
What you
need is control of natural resources, which they're taking in the east, and you need access to the heartbeat, the blood flow of food and money into the country, which they're taking in the south. The fact that Ukraine had to go to the negotiation table with Russia and Turkey in order to get exports out of the Black Sea approved again demonstrates just how much Ukraine is losing. The aggressor had a seat at the negotiation table to allow Ukraine the ability to even export one of its top exports. If Russia would have said no, then they would not have had that. Russia has, that's like someone holding your throat. It's like somebody holding your jugular vein and saying, if you don't do what I tell you to do, then I'm not going to let you breathe. I'm not going to let blood flow to your brain.
So do you think it's possible that Russia takes the south of Ukraine? It takes, so starting from Mariupol, the Kherson region,
All the way to Odessa
all the way to Odessa.
and into Moldova. I believe all of that will happen before the fall
Fall of this year?
of this year. Before winter hits Europe, NATO wants, Germany needs to be able to have sanctions lifted so they can tap into Russian power. There's no way they can have those sanctions lifted unless Russia wins. And Russia also knows that all of Europe, all of NATO is the true people feeling the pain of the war outside of Ukraine are the NATO countries because they're so heavily reliant on Russia. And as they have supported American sanctions against Russia, their people feel the pain. Economically, their people feel the pain. What are they going to do in the winter? Because without Russian gas, their people are going to freeze to death.
Ukrainian people.
People all over NATO. Ukraine, everybody knows Ukraine's at risk. Everybody knows Ukrainians are dying. The game of war isn't played it isn't even played majoritively by the people who are fighting. The game of war is played by everyone else. It's an economic game. It's not a military game.
The flow of resources and energy,
Attention.
and food.
Exactly right.
I was on the front in the Kherson region, this very area that you're referring to, and I spoke to a lot of people, and the morale is incredibly high. And I don't think the people in that region, soldiers, volunteer soldiers, civilians, are going to give up that land without dying.
I agree with you.
I mean, in order to take Odessa would require huge amount of artillery and slaughter of civilians, essentially.
They're not going to use artillery in Odessa because Odessa is too important to Russian culture. It's going to be even uglier than that. It's going to be clearing of streets, clearing of buildings, person by person, troop by troop. It'll be a lot like what it was in Mariupol.
Just shooting at civilians.
Because they can't afford to just do bombing raids because they're going to destroy cultural, significant architecture that's just too important to the Russian culture. And that's going to demoralize their own Russian people.
I have to do a lot of thinking to try to understand what I even feel. I don't know. But in terms of information, the thing that the soldiers are saying, the Russian soldiers are saying, the thing the Russian soldiers really believe is that they're liberating the Ukrainian people from Nazis.
Mm.
And they believe this. Because I visited Ukraine, I spoke to over 100, probably a couple hundred Ukrainian people from different walks of life. It feels like the Russian soldiers, at least, are under a cloud of propaganda. They're not operating on a clear view of the whole world. And given all that, I just don't see Russia taking the South without committing war crimes. And if Vladimir Putin is aware of what's happening in terms of the treatment of civilians, I don't see him pushing forward all the way to take the South, because that's not going to be effective strategy for him to win the hearts and minds of these people.
Autocracies don't need to win hearts and minds. That's a staunchly democratic point of view. Hearts and minds mean very little to people who understand core, basic needs and true power. You don't see Xi Jinping worrying about hearts and minds in China. You don't see it in North Korea. You don't see it in Congo. You don't see it in most of the world. Hearts and minds are a luxury. In reality, what people need is food, water, power. They need income to be able to secure a lifestyle. It is absolutely sad. I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that my assessment on this is enriching or enlightening or hopeful. It's just fact. It's just calculatable empirical evidence. If Putin loses in Ukraine, the losses, the influential losses, the economic losses, the lives lost, the power lost is too great. So it is better for him to push and push and push through war crimes, through everything else. War crimes are something defined by the international court system. The international court system has Russia as part of its board. And the international court system is largely powerless outside when it comes to enforcing its own outcomes. So the real risk gain scenario here for Russia is significantly in favor of gain over risk. The other thing that I think is important to talk about is everybody is trapped in the middle of a gigantic information war. Yes, there's battlefield bullets and cannons and tanks, but there's also a massive informational war. The same narrative that you see these ground troops in Ukraine, these Russian ground troops in Ukraine, believing they're clearing the land of Nazis, that information is being fed to them from their own home country. I don't know why people seem to think that the information that they're reading in English is any more or less true. Every piece of news coming out of the West, every piece of information coming out in the English language is also a giant narrative being shared intentionally to try to undermine the morale and the faithfulness of English-speaking Russians, which somebody somewhere knows exactly how many of those there are. So we have to recognize that we're not getting true information from other side, because there is a strategic value in making sure that there is just the right amount of mis or disinformation out there. Not because someone's trying to lie to Americans, but because someone is trying to influence the way English-speaking Russians think. And in that world, that's exactly why you see so many news articles cited to anonymous sources, government officials who do not want to be named. There's nothing that links back responsibility there, right? There's nothing that can go to court there. But the information still gets released, and that's enough to make Ukrainians believe that the United States is going to help them, or that the West is going to help them. It's enough to make Russians think that they're going to lose, and maybe they should just give up now and leave from the battlefield now. We have to understand we are in the middle of a giant information war.
Maybe you can correct me, but it feels like in the English-speaking world, it's harder to control. It's harder to fight the information war because of, some people say there's not really a freedom of speech in this country, but I think if you compare, there's a lot more freedom of speech. And it's just harder to control narratives when there's a bunch of guerrilla journalists that are able to just publish anything they want on Twitter or anything. It's just harder to control narratives.
So people don't understand what freedom of speech is. That's the first major problem. And it's shameful how many people in the United States do not understand what freedom of speech actually protects. So that aside, you're absolutely right. Fighting the information war in the West is extremely difficult because anyone with a blog, anyone with a Twitter account, anyone can call themselves a journalist, essentially. We live in a country where people read the headline and they completely bypass the author line and they go straight into the content. And then they decide whether the content's real or not based on how they feel instead of based on empirical, measurable evidence.
So you mentioned the Lend-Lease Act and the support of the United States, support of Ukraine by the United States. Are you skeptical to the level of support that the United States is providing and is going to provide over time?
The strategy that the United States has taken to support Ukraine is similar to the strategy we took to support Great Britain during World War II. The enactment of the Lend-Lease Act is a perfect example of that. The Lend-Lease Act means that we are lending or leasing equipment to the Ukrainian government in exchange for future payment. So every time a rocket is launched, every time a drone crashes into a tank, that's a bill that Ukraine is just racking up. It's like when you go to a restaurant and you start drinking shots. Sometime the bill will come due. This is exactly what we did when Europe and when Great Britain was in the face of Nazi invasion. We signed the same thing into motion. Do you know that the UK did not pay off the debt from World War II until 2020? They've been paying that debt since the end of World War II. So what we're doing is we're indebting Ukraine against the promise that perhaps they will secure their freedom, which nobody seems to want to talk about what freedom is actually going to look like for Ukrainians, right? What are the true handful of outcomes, the realistic outcomes that could come of this, and which of those outcomes really looks like freedom to them, especially in the face of the fact that they're going to be trillions of dollars in debt to the West for supplying them with the training and the weapons and the food and the med kits and everything else that we're giving them, because none of it's free. It's all coming due. We're a democracy, but we're also a capitalist country. We can't afford to just give things away for free, but we can give things away at a discount. We can give things away layaway, but the bill will come due. And unfortunately, that is not part of the conversation that's being had with the American people.
So debt is a way to establish some level of control.
Power.
Is power. That said, having a very close relationship between Ukraine and the United States does not seem to be a negative possibility when the Ukrainians think about their future in terms of freedom. That's one thing. And the other, there's some aspect of this war that I've just noticed that one of the people I talked to said that all great nations have a independence war, have to have a war for their independence. There's something, it's dark, but there's something about war just being a catalyst for finding your own identity as a nation. So you can have leaders, you can have sort of signed documents, you can have all this kind of stuff, but there's something about war that really brings the country together and actually try to figure out what is at the core of the spirit of the people that defines this country. And they see this war as that, as the independence war to define the heart of what the country is. So there's been before the war, before this invasion, there was a lot of factions in the country. There was a lot of influence from oligarchs and corruption and so on. A lot of that was the factions were brought together under one umbrella, effectively to become one nation because of this invasion. So they see that as a positive direction for the defining of what a free democratic country looks like after the war, in their perspective, after the war is won.
It's a difficult situation because I'm trying to make sure that you and everybody listening understands that what's happening in Ukraine among Ukrainians is noble and brave and courageous and beyond the expectations of anyone. The fact is, there is no material support coming from the outside. The American Revolution was won because of French involvement. French ships, French troops, French generals, French military might. The independence of communist China was won through Russian support, Russian generals, Russian troops on the ground fighting with the communists. That's how revolutions are won. That's how independent countries are born. Ukraine doesn't get any of that. No one is stepping into that because we live in a world right now where there simply is no economic benefit to the parties in power to support Ukraine to that level. And war is a game of economics. The economic benefit of Ukraine is crystal clear in favor of Russia, which is why Putin cannot lose. He will not let himself lose. Short of something completely unexpected, right? I'm talking 60%, 70% probability, Ukraine loses. But there's still 20%, 30% probability of the unimaginable happening. Who knows what that might be? An oligarch assassinates Putin, or a nuclear bomb goes off somewhere, or who knows what, right? There's still a chance that something unexpected will happen and change the tide of the war. But when it comes down to the core calculus here, Ukraine is the agricultural bed to support a future Russia. Russia knows they have to have Ukraine. They know that they have to have it to protect themselves against military pressure from the West. They have to have it for agricultural reasons. They have major oil and natural gas pipelines that flow through eastern Ukraine. They cannot let Ukraine fall outside of their sphere of influence. They cannot. The United States, doesn't really have any economic vested interest in Ukraine. Ideological points of view and promises aside, there's no economic benefit. And the same thing goes for NATO. NATO has no economic investment in Ukraine. Ukrainian output, Ukrainian food goes to the Middle East and Africa. It doesn't go to Europe. So the West siding with Ukraine is exclusively ideological, and it's putting them in a place where they fight a war with Russia so the whole world can see Russia's capabilities. Ukraine is as sad as it is to say, man, Ukraine is a pawn on a table for superpowers to calculate each other's capacities. Right now, we've only talked about Russia and the United States. We haven't even talked about Iran. We haven't even talked about China, right? It is a pawn on a table. This is a chicken fight so that people get to watch and see what the other trainers are doing.
Well, a lot of people might have said the same thing about the United States back in the independence fight. So there is possibilities, as you've said. We're not saying 0% chance, and it could be a reasonably high percent chance that this becomes one of the great democratic nations that the 21st century is remembered by.
Absolutely.
And so you said American support. So ideologically, first of all, you don't assign much long-term